Team's here, OG.
We're here.
Great. Uh-oh. Nggak kedengeran? Uh-oh. Are you there?
Here. Hello.
Okay.
Okay.
Now audible. That's good. CG.
CG complete.
Fantastic. CO. CO.
Complete.
Okay, great. So yeah, welcome to the Seger Open practice of tonight. I'm going to be your chair. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask everyone to please use gender neutral pronouns. I think it's fitting with the motion as well to refer to each other and use your own timer. Yeah, I'm going to be sharing timing signals in chat, but probably not exactly on the seconds to taking notes. You'll have your own timer that will be much more accurate to track your debate. Speaking time 7 minutes. Yeah, don't be too far beyond that. So okay, let's go. Prime Minister, please. You're here.
Wait, I'm setting up my timer, yeah? Okay. So, am I audible?
Yes. Kedengeran.
Okay. I prefer all POIs through the chat box, yeah? Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Discrimination against gender is the first form of discrimination and oppression that humanity has ever experienced, right? But dated back to when, for example, Eve having to have permission from Adam, for example, to do shit even on the Garden of Eve, for example, shows to you how essentially, gender oppression is something that dates back lots of years, something that is ingrained in the society, and something that in order for us to truly become equal, in order for all beings to not be discriminated, in terms of, to decrease discrimination of humans, we need to abolish gender, right? So what side government is trying to, going to, defend here is a world on which that there is no gender in the beginning, on which that, there's somewhat a machine that is able to create clean slates, for example, for all human to not, to not have gender and to not identify themselves as a certain gender and for at the end of the day, right? But to clear things up, what is gender, right? Because gender is a social construct on which that humans have created, for example, to create expectations, right? On how a certain person needs to behave. For example, if you are born with a penis, for example, then you're expected, for example, to have the gender of a boy, for example, or at least for a gender of a masculine person, for example. Even if, for example, sex is not sex is not part of the variable, the gender talks about, not the expression on which you are seen, for example, by the society as a whole, right? But the side government is not just, we think that gender is not just a form of expression, right? It's also a form of values, for example. Things like masculinity is also, for a masculinity, like we're talking about not just, for example, people trying to portray themselves as masculine, but also the values entails to it. Like, for example, values like individualism, values like competition, things that radical feminists has defined, for example, as masculine, or femininity is seen as someone who is, for example, nurturing, has a good sense of communality, or someone who is able, for example, to be patient. These are the things that gender entails, right? That side government do not want to exist, right? Whereas side opposition needs to defend essentially a world where gender and the expressions and values that exist then exist in their side of the house is going to actually bring betterment and equality, for example, for all the people who practice it, right? So I'll be talking about 3 things. One, I'll be talking about 2 things, right? One, why gender sucks and prevents equality. No, thank you. Secondly, about why abolishment of gender is the only way to have that solution, right? So first point about why gender sucks and it prevents equality, right? One thing, there's already a structural oppression, right, against gender expressions, for example, who are necessarily not masculine, who are then seen as a lesser gender, right? The world is historically crafted as a super masculine world, right? With the values that are seen as someone who needs to be seen as decisive, for example, who values the idea of competition in order to drive, for example, power. The fact that capitalism is designed and crafted to adhere to these kinds of values shows to you, right, that the masculine gender is always preferred and always, seen as much more important and much more beneficial for the people as a whole. Things like, like feelings, being emotional, things that are usually associated with femininity are always seen as a hindrance, something that is always seen as weak, for example, that is an undesirable traits by humans every day, right? The impacts of this are massive, right? For example, not in economic wise, people who are able to portray themselves as masculine, even women, for example, who are seen as masculine, are continuously being rewarded by good ability to climb up the ladders because they're seen as much more beneficial. But moreover, right, because even on the idea of relationships with another, people usually prefer the idea of people who are much more masculine, simply because they see that the narrative on which that it does not provide them more drama or whatever, without the efforts that shows that the impact of it is multitudes, right? But the efforts of attaining equality that happens in status quo are not able, for example, to accommodate to all genders, right? What it does, for example, is actually urges everyone to become much more masculine, for example, in order for them to be accepted by society, right? Feminism, for example, whose fight is whose narrative comes down to, okay, girls are also decisive, girls are also competitive, girls are also able to lead and whatever, because these are the things that does not accommodate to all gender expressions, but limits and washes down people who might have different gender expressions, and only urges everyone to become another form of gender expression, right? What the harm is clear, right? You are clearly sidelining people who are able to express themselves, who wants to opt into a certain way of expression, are now being seen as someone who is not important and should be changed, right? Why is this problem structural? Two reasons, right? One, we think that historically is one of the oldest forms of problems, oldest forms of kind of oppression that happens, right? Which has become very entrenched into our culture, that it's very hard, right? The fact that people, still sees that women, the fact that even in feminism, for example, there are still essentialist feminism, for essentialist radical feminism, who sees that women inherently has, natural ability to be nurturing, whatever, shows that even in the most progressive kinds of progressive kinds of movement, that humanity are always seeing that certain gender has certain traits, and others have different traits, therefore enabling the oppression that happens by masculinity, for example, into the other kind of expression, right? But secondly, with that, because it's easily enforceable, it's very hard to get rid of, right? The fact that women continuously give birth and so on and so forth, and how, for example, since lots of years, the fact that women give birth allows them to be automatically seen as nurturing, for example, as someone who already has automatic bond with their child, for example, are things that are hard to fight at the end of the day, right? Because it gives certain expectations that creates, this kind of image of women continuously being fighted for. So why is abolishment of gender the only way, right? By having clean slate, we are actually going to, able to discard all of these structural problems that exist, right? People are more free, for example, to express themselves in their everyday life when there are no expectations that are crafted upon them and would able to fulfill their sense of worth. Under those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Good. Thank you very much for the Prime Minister for those remarks. Leader of Opposition, please. Here. leader of opposition.
Am I audible?
Now, yes.
Bentar ya. Boleh
law.
bentar ya? Sorry. Wait, okay. I'll be accepting POI through just like open your mic. Wait, let me rearrange my papers. Okay. Astagfirullah, maaf Akhi. Lo women phobic deh. Oke.
Ya, benar.
Maaf ya. Ya udah, mari kita mulai. Ladies and gentlemen, as a woman, I find great satisfaction and joy from being able to express myself as a woman. I refuse to believe what OG says, that the existing problem that we have right now is just caused by someone having a certain affiliation at the end of the day. As our stance is simple, we think that gender is something that is necessary, and the expression that it entails and the ability for you to define who you are through it is something that is meaningful and something that is precious, and we should cherish it. We're going to defend a world where the spectrum of gender exists, where people are able to identify themselves as any gender that they want, even the fluidity of the gender. Maybe people can identify themselves as men, women, non-binary, agender, or whatever. We want to give those type of freedom towards everyone. And we also can see that our current world is fucked up, ladies and gentlemen. We're not trying to say that there is no discrimination against any gender. That's why we also strive for a world where discrimination against a certain gender, the glorification of a certain gender to be abolished, where a gender, every single one of them will be treated equally and the same way, and people are not going to be discriminated or harmed throughout it. In my speech, I'm going to talk about principally why gender is an important form of identity, and why the existence of gender stereotypes is not something that is inherently harmful. Before that, several rebuttals. We believe that what OG has presented to you is just a mere shop list of the harm of or problems that we have currently, right? First, they talk about discrimination. We believe that discrimination in government world will always exist, even if there is no gender identity whatsoever. Because we think that they still can see that there are still differences in sex appearance, right, in between people. Because even if you are like, let's say, a bird that does not have any penis and you just basically have a cloaca, there are still differences in like the male and female physiology. We believe that the moment that you strive for a world where there is no gender, societal value will always demand you to appear as a gender as possible. Why? Because society likes having things that are homogenous, ladies and gentlemen. Society likes things that are familiar to them, and the majority is something that is familiar to them. So therefore, they're still going to enforce other people to become as a gender as possible. And this is something that is very harmful, because if sex exists and physiological differences exist, some people will still appear not as a gender as the other people, right? Because maybe those people are curvier or whatever, and therefore these people are going to be discriminated and be demanded to appear as agendered as possible. And this is something that is very, very wrong, ladies and gentlemen, because first, they are still discriminated, and secondly, you also take away a major part of their self-expression, which I'm going to explain later. We believe that the problem that OG have with the over glorification of masculinity and whatever is the problem of patriarchy, not the problem of gender inherently. Moving on to my points, right? First, why gender is an important form of identity for everyone. We can see that someone can have an identity that is not gender. You can identify yourself as a biologist. You can identify yourself as, let's say, a capitalist or whatever, right? But we also, I think you also agree that people always find meaning in life throughout their identity, ladies and gentlemen. But we think that gender is a special type of identity. It's something that is very, very precious. Why? because this is something that closely relate to yourself, because this is something that you're going to encounter every seconds of the day. Even if when you're by yourself, you're still going to encounter the fact that you have the ability to express yourself as, let's say, a female, or as a woman or a man, or like even a non-binary, ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that gender is the most basic way for you to express yourself, to express who you are, based on your gender identity, based on your preferences and whatever. And it also dictates how you express yourself and how you choose your life partner. It also oftentimes influence your sexuality and your interests at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. And this is something that is important, because having a medium of expression is something that is crucial, because we currently live in a world where everyone is demanded to be to work all the time. So therefore your form of expression is oftentimes very, very limited, ladies and gentlemen, because maybe you don't have the time to express your hobby, maybe you don't even have the time to read the books that you like, and or whatever. Meanwhile, gender expression is something that is very, very simple. That's something that you can do very simply, based on just like a haircut, choice of clothing, the way you talk and whatever. So therefore this is something that closely belongs to yourself, therefore it's something that is important. And secondly, we believe also gender stereotype is not inherently harmful, ladies and gentlemen, because we can see the status quo is fucked up. There's sort of some glorification of whatever. We think that having a stereotype is something that is actually good, because it helps you to find who you are. It helps you to affiliate yourself with other people just based on your appearance. And we believe that every single gender and every single stereotype that they carry has a neutral value, ladies and gentlemen. For example, when you are a female, or when you are a woman, when you are stereotyped to be someone that's, and maybe you are also identified as someone that is maturing or soft, as someone that is more can cooperate better. We believe that is something that is also good. Why? Because current leadership program also adopts those type of qualities. Right? There are a lot of startups that try to bring forward more values and collaboration and whatever. And even in male, when you are more, let's say, stereotyped to be more authoritative and masculine and whatever, it's something that also can bring value within ourselves. So therefore, we do not. Uh, the certification of the value itself is actually non-existent, and we believe that having this kind of we also believe that the current status quo also already leads you to a place where different types of gender expression, even within the same, let's say, category of gender, is already more is already less strict as it was at the beginning, ladies and gentlemen. For example, you see more men wearing skirts, for example, Harry Styles, Billy Porter, and whatever, and more, let's quote unquote, butchy female, like Clinton and whatever. So we believe that the problems that OG presents to you is not inherent towards gender. The changes that we try to make actually makes a difference. We are very proud to oppose.
Julio, thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. Continuing OG's case, DPM, please.
Test. Am I audible?
Yep. Clear.
Okay, cool. Let me set up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that the biggest problem with OO's case is that they don't want to defend status quo at all, right? To save their case, they could have explained, for example, how progress is being made in the current status quo, how things are getting better, but they didn't. The reason why Elgard argued about masculinity, femininity, implicitly talking about patriarchy, is the fact that gender and oppression that comes from gender is something that's very inherent, something that's consolidated over the test of time. The fact that we've gotten to the year 2000s and before years were even being counted, gender is something that already exists and enforced upon babies who just got birth and even before born, means that this is a harm that will definitely happen. You can't just discard patriarchy and describe our world as something that, as status quo, as something that happens in a vacuum, right? So we don't think that they can run away from explaining and defending the status quo, where patriarchy is rampant, where, for example, oppression that's based on gender is something that happens anyway. So don't take OO's case. So I'm going to be talking about several things in my speech. First of all, how being best self-actualized. Second of all, talking about the sense of community and how, for example, people are going to be able to defend themselves as a community. So in the first class, talking about self-actualization, right? They try to argue to you that, for example, oh, gender is the simplest and easiest way for you to express yourself. But look, we don't think that this is something that's essentially true, because when you talk about something that's easy to do, you need to explain how people even got there in the first place, right? We want to, here's how we envision our world. We think that expression is going to be more free. There's going to be no restrictions, in the sense that by the time you were born, by the time you can actually choose your own clothes, you can choose it on your own. There's no prerequisite, there's no preset conditions as to what kind of clothing you have in your house, right? For example, we think that at the time that you were children, for example, when you have gender, parents are already going to be choosing for you. For example, if you're a boy, you only have car clothing, you only have, for example, blue clothing, and as a girl, you only have pink clothing, you only have ballerina tutus, and so on and so forth, right? We think that these kind of things is not going to exist on our side of the house, because if you have no gender, that means that people have more time to explore, right? That's exactly the concern that we see coming in status quo. The fact that a lot of non-binary people, or for example, a lot of trans people, talk about how they feel regretful and they regret the time that they wasted over concerns of what they should wear, over concerns of their exploration. They feel like they could have had more time to explore, and so on and so forth, right? We think that exactly on our side of the house, you have all the time in the world for you to explore your preferences, for you to explore what kind of expression you like the most. But even if not, we think that expression at the end of the day on both sides of the house is still going to, even if expression is still restricted on both sides of the house, we think that it's going to be much better on our side of the house. Because at least we think that the expression that's going to be restricted is going to be based off things that are pragmatic, things like safety concerns, things like, for example, other concerns like cultural appropriation, and so on and so forth. It's probably going to be much better than simply referring to the kind of gender that you have. But second of all, talking about how then we progress in the current status quo, how then you fight for the betterment of a community, right? They try to argue to you that, look, you can't just defend and shoplift the problem of patriarchy. We don't think that this is true, right? Because exactly the problem with gender in the current status quo, the problem of a world that started with gender, is that sexism is consolidated in the current status quo. And the process has already took on countless victims, right? First of all, you have the activists who literally fight against the binary of gender, against only male and female. And these people are literally being killed by governments, literally being hunted down by religions, and so on and so forth. So that's already the first kind of victim. Second of all, it caused grievances that may never be broadcasted, that may never be surfaced. For example, a father who has already had a family, who has already given birth and have a wife, may not be able to celebrate the coming out of their son simply because they feel like, oh, they should have had the access to that kind of freedom, to that kind of gender expression, but they didn't. There's a lot of grievances that go unnoticed in the current status quo, but are murdering and making people feel hurt every day, right? That's the kind of thing that we regret in the current world. That's why our motion states that we just simply want a world where everyone starts at the same starting point, everyone has no idea and no concept of gender, as opposed to the abolition of gender, right? Second of all, COO tried to argue to you that society is going to enforce people to become a gender because society simply likes uniformity. We don't think that this is true, right? Because expression and diversity of expression is something that is exotic and is something that's attractive to people, right? That's why people really like it when they come to Southeast Asian countries and they see a diversity in food, they see diversity in the people. That's why people find it fun to travel to other countries and see different kind of faces and so on and so forth, right? We think that exactly because people are more likely going to be more appreciative of the diversity of the people when they do not learn and they were never enforced. most of the time, sexism in the current status quo is enforced because they felt like they were already subjected to it. Therefore, everyone else also must be subjected to the same kind of standards. We think that this is going to be different in a world without gender, where your approach to expression, like clothing, like who you love, and so on and so forth, is going to be a much more individualistic approach, right? Like it happens from yourself, and you understand that this is something that you cannot apply to everyone, like a blanket policy. But even if not, right? Even if it ends up uniformly, we think that it's going to be much better because, again, it's going to be very pragmatic, right? Because notice in the current status quo, people are still forced to wear certain things anyway. But in the current status quo, it's the result of patriarchy. It's the result of consolidated forced gender upon people, right? For example, women in formal events, instead of allowing them to wear suits, you force them to wear skirts. For example, women in the entertainment, they're forced to wear revealing dresses as opposed to like suits, just like other men, and so on and so forth, right? We think that at least on our side of the house, if people are going to be subjected to something, they're going to be able to have things that are pragmatically beneficial for them, pragmatically comfortable to them. But let's compare, right? Even if they try to defend the status quo in their DLO, we don't think that this is possible because, exactly, if discrimination still exists anyway, the best way for you to operate as a nation is to make sure that there are less costs and less trade-off as a person, right? We think that in the current status quo, it's very hard for you to become an SJW, and you probably only opt into one kind of social activism because it's, for example, emotionally taxing, or it requires a lot of resources and so on and so forth. So you have to choose, for example, if you want to defend race, then you're probably going to be a full-time Black Lives activist. If you want to defend gender, you're going to be a full-time gender activist. We think that it's going to be much better when you eradicate one sort of classification, because that means that people have more time and more agency to fight against any other kind of oppression, right? We think that it's just simply going to be much more easier and much more efficient. So that's why we're very proud to propose.
Good, thank you. Now, finally closing the opening half, opening opposition. Sorry, Deputy Leader of Opposition, please. Here.
Check, am I audible?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay, let me set up my timer first. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about three things. Like, first of all, I'm going to talk about why patriarchy is an inherent harm and why people aren't going to start from the same starting point in OG. Secondly, I'm going to talk about expression. Why is it important? Why is it accessible? And why is it better under OO? And lastly, I'm going to talk about progress and fighting against oppression. Right, the likelihood they pointed out with explained. Right, sure. All right, on the first point, right? Why patriarchy is an excessive harm, an inherent harm under OO, like it's still happen under OG. Do still exist, right? If Vince Smith to know his point, it's still, for example, because they're with the biological needs to take care of, will still be tasked with doing that, right? And doing a certain job. We think that it's not enough for Kezia just to say to come to something exotic, and yeah, will still be in value of having people have different types of expression. No, right? Because society doesn't care for this kind of exotic thing. They want to they want economic they want economic value. They want to be efficient. Putting people in boxes according to what sex and doing their job is what's efficient for them. We think that it will happen. So why will it be worse? Why does it when you have this oppression, it's better for you to have a gender, right? Because first is we think that it allows for a wider definition who a person is, right? It allows you for gender allows us to see that there's a spectrum even in the female sex, for example, or in the male sex. But it allows us to see that some women might have stronger muscles, right, if they train it right. They may be more suitable becoming fighters or like whatever. And also maybe some men are more nurturing, right? Because and they could be suitable in jobs such as like being a of that. We think that what it allows under OO is that it allows society to comprehend better the reasonings if an individual is not able to fulfill a certain role that is what's going to happen under OG, right? Because they don't, there's no justification. Sorry, for example, when you're you have the male sex and like you're not masculine enough, there's no understanding coming from. We think that it's much moving on to my second point, right? I'm going to talk about, all right, first of all, why is this expression important, right? Because what Noni talks innate nature, right? Your sex and that's it. It doesn't tell you what clothes you're supposed to like, right? What is your sexuality? What males or not, right? What kind, just like kind of expression are you more comfortable of using? We think that exploring your gender and trying out what suits for you is the only way for people to find out and to find value by knowing themselves, identifying themselves as something more than physical sex, right? Which is gender, right? Because it's on another level. Finding guidance is only possible for you to happen when you have this concept first. Why is this expression accessible, right? Unlike what OG told you, people do have time to try it out. People are told of this because why? When the concept exists, we think that discussions will exist too, right? When the concept exists, you will see examples in the society, right? You will be taught that there are genders, right? There are men, women, or maybe there are a spectrum of genders, right? And you will be you will see the examples in the society, and you can choose on what you want on what you relate to the most. We think that you're also taught to how to make a good choice. The discussions will only access when you have the concept, right? But at the end of the day, why expression is going to be better than under OO and under OG? We think that it's not about expression is never about practicality, right? Because if your expression is constrained to things that are practical, it's going to be like North Korea, right? Everything is dull. Everyone has the same haircut, for example. We think that no, people aren't even able to actually express themselves when they're still confused of what they're supposed to be, right? Because they're only defined by their sex. People expression under opposition would be better because people would actually have a better understanding of who they are, like and who they want to, what kind of individual that they want to be. We think that at the end of the day, this kind of expression is going to be more fulfilling as is better than under OG. But lastly, regarding progress and fighting against oppression, right? Why is this something that's likely? We think that it's quite proven in the status quo that gender has the definitions of gender has progressed, right? But yeah, just to explain it, why is it likely, right? Because we think that people relating on something very innate to themselves, for example, like what they wear, like how they express themselves, and the gestures of their hands, and just the same kind of gender you are defined as and you are grouped as in society. I think that that's only possible under OO, right? When you actually when you can identify what a certain gender that's affiliated with yourself. I think that at the end of the day, having this group of who you can affiliate with, finding a community that have the common struggles as you will actually make it is what leads to the discussions and leads to the fight that allows gender definitions to actually progress, right? Because the discussions that's going to happen under opposition is the discussions that's going to be specific, right? It's about gender related problems, right? For example, like something like wage gap is only identified when you actually identify the women gender, right? And it's not going to be it's not going to happen under OG. So we think that it's progress will actually more likely to happen under OO also. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for giving the proposition. I'd like to continue with the closing half of this debate. Member of government, please. Here.
Test, am I audible?
Yep, very clear.
Okay, nice. We're gonna start my speech. POI can be done through chat box. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that OG did a really good job in explaining how this type of proposal will most likely abolish the gender discrimination itself. But what differed the OG from closing government are simply because we're going to touch at the very best scenario at what is the possibility cases that are coming from opening opposition, and we're going to take that at face value. We are going to argue these cases more on principle level, regardless that there's discrimination where access or non-access, like what the OO claims, regardless all the progress that happened in status quo, why it isn't going to be better even in our case. Two substantive that I will bring. That number one, there are two questions that I will ask. That number one, we think that gender are actually enabled to accommodate all spectrum of human expression in terms of their sex. And second, why we think that gender expression is not an absolute good, like what opening opposition are trying to bring in this debate. Okay, now first thing first, why we don't think that gender can accommodate all spectrum of expression that human has. Ladies and gentlemen, the existence of gender in status quo is that they are always being put into boxes. For example, it's either that you are woman, or it is you are man, or in between. There are always various spectrum, but there are boxes inside that. You can be transgender, you can be transsexual, or whatever that is exists between that spectrum, right? But why we think that this spectrum is inherently harmful, regardless how diverse it is, and how many times that we can able to put this, we can create a smaller boxes between this idea. That why we think that is likely the cases, because number one, we don't think that we think that gender are inherently something that are very fluid, right? You can be very masculine right now, but you can be like very feminine later in the future, right? We think that the opening opposition said it's good when you're trying. The opening opposition like to claim this idea as a self-actualization and self-identifying in itself, right? But why we think that it's inherently bad to put gender and basis to it, and to put gender and boxes in it, right? We think that it's why we don't think that it's because number one, we think that inherently that between these boxes, you will try to fit yourself to certain boxes, right? For example, that you try to be as masculine as possible, or either you're trying to be as feminine as possible. There are always been standard upon what kind of gender that you're trying to express yourself into, right? Why we think that this is something that will actually harmful because you cannot able to fulfill the expectation that are created by the society in accordance to what kind of identity that you are trying to fit into. Although that this opening opposition might say that, but you're not going to be forced, you're not going to be discriminated upon this idea, but the expectation are still exist, right? The relatability that opening opposition are trying to bring, it means to you that you have to have a certain identity before you are related into, right? We think that people are constantly develop themselves. They are constantly trying to figure out who they are and what kind of identity that they are matching themselves with, right? When someone's grow out of a phrase and someone's try to grow out a certain gender phrases like what the opening opposition tried to claim, we think that there's always been burden for you to try to self-discover yourself and etc. We think that is inherently bad because in current status quo, there are a lot of division that human beings are able to identify into, right? They can identify themselves as Muslim, they can identify themselves as Christian and etc. We think that this division will inherently exist. And we think that gender is not the only way that we could eventually try to explore, to express ourselves in the end of the day. We think that even the existence of gender is inherently harmful for the pre-existing and other identity that is accessed in status quo. Another thing that is actually need to be notified upon is on how transgender were being put in the world with gender. When transgender access in this world, they were always being shut up by women, and even feminists are trying to shut them up because they are someone who are a class traitor, that gender traitor, who are actively try to reject their identity and etc. We think that. And whilst women or men in which that they try to go into never truly accept them, this is the people who are trying to figure out what kind of gender that they are, right? We think that these people who are in between will most likely then not will start to we're going to continuously confuse upon what kind of boxes and what kind of identity that they should put into. People are less and more strict in status quo to determine and what to impose standard on you and what kind of is it inside of the background itself. We think that this is something that is not good inherently in the end of the day. it is inherently burdening for you to choose. It's better in status quo, it's better in our proposal, because there's no inherent burden for you to choose what kind of identity that you are aligned into. Second, why we think that the gender expression is not an absolute good. Look, gender expression in status quo were created by patriarchal standard. The reasons why you opening opposition bench might say is that it's feel empowering when I as a woman dress with the beautiful dresses, and it is part of my gender expression inherently, right? It's not because society asks me to wear dresses that I wear dress. But here is the thing: gender expression such as this, and which you saw this very empowering, is actually something that is very ironic. Why? You choose to wear dresses and try to reclaim that when you wear dresses you will feel powerful, is because you also as a woman you are trying so hard to fight against patriarchal standard and any kind of standard that are imposed to you as a woman. You feel powerful when you wear dresses. It's not because you feel related to that dress, because actually you are trying to rebel against society's standard that women were always being depicted as demure, submissive, and someone that cannot fight against men when they wear dresses, because they are always being depicted as someone submissive. You as a powerful woman, when you wear that dresses, you feel that you try to defy the society standard inherently, right? What does it mean? It means when your gender expression itself is actually something that inherent constructed by patriarchal society, right? It means that it's only powerful because it came from the irony that because you cannot feel empowered in any other sector, because you're constantly discriminated of your identity, you're constantly being deprived for your chances to get access to what express yourself inherently, right? Because you feel powerful with the way you dresses. It's because it's a method for you to rebel against the system, rebel against the standard that are imposed by society in regard of your gender in itself. That's why you are most likely only comfortable to wear certain clothes, and if only you are only goes with your own bubble, your own liberal bubbles, and etc. Right? Because that's the only way that you can feel against the society standard, against any kind of expression itself. We think that in the world without gender, there's no imposing for you. There's no need for you to express your gender, because it's not part of self-expression that actually, because there's no expectation on what kind of clothes that you're trying to bring. Society will not try to impose what kind of standard. You will not feel powerful. Yes, that's true. But that's not something bad, because in our side, you'll only feel powerful because society are thinking that you should dress a certain way, in a certain manner in itself. And an artistic means and the way that you dress is we will be seen as something artistic expression, rather than something that is gendered, rather than something that you should obey it to, right? Not to mention, we think that identity and try to define your identity is not an absolute good. Why? Why the opposition side of the house has the burden to prove why identity, who constantly divide individuals, are something that has to be defended into. Ladies and gentlemen, we already have so much identity going on in this world. Religious identity, class identity, and racial identity are already going on. And this is the reasons why human encounters who are constantly fight against each other. There's no unity inside of these people, and it's always been used as a method to weaponize against certain other group who are being discriminated, and etc. Why we think that abolishing one at the very least is not something that are good and something to be abolished. But this is the reasons why people are attacking each other because of their identity. Based on this justification, we back to propose the motion.
Right, thank you very much. We'd like to ask the member of opposition to open CO's case now. Here.
Check, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, arranging my paper first. All right, if you want to give POI, please send it to the chat box. Yeah, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Notice that the case coming from the closing government is about how that there are a lot of spectrums of identity other than gender. For example, like race or religion that is used as a tool to weaponize others, shows that discrimination might still exist under the world of OG and also under the world of CG. So in the elimination of gender that they want to achieve, they want to envision, we think that if they want to bring the idea of discrimination, it will still exist under the basis of the other identity. For example, race, religion. That is exactly why we've seen African American being persecuted constantly in the US, or Islamophobia exists, or even Christianity being denounced in a lot of Muslim countries. We think that at the end of the day, it shows you that discrimination happens not because of a certain gender, but there is this asymmetrical power imposed by the majority. Therefore, this power imbalance still exists under the world of OG and CG. So we think that it is a mismatch solution if they want to eradicate the case of persecution, discrimination of the gender. As CO, realizing that there are certain discrimination or certain persecution that exists, we are going to prove to you why at the end of the day, in our side of the house, the fluidity of the gender will give opt-out mechanism for a certain people or escape mechanism just to topple down that discrimination in a personal level. So the contribution of CO is pretty simple. We're going to prove to you why there is a uniqueness of gender that you need to retain, and elimination of gender in their world will be harmful rather than our side of the house. Now, going to the case on the uniqueness of the gender. In our side of the house, we believe that the gender in itself, the gender assignment that is personalized in our side, gives a full self-actualization for a certain individual. What does it make? Difference with the race or the religion and such? In our side of the house, we believe that race and also religion is strict by the nature. They are not open to interpretation at all. They're very, very deeply rooted. And the moment when we create a certain challenge, it is seen as a sin. And let's talk about the race. We think that in a race, it is something that is an inborn factor that you cannot even change, ladies and gentlemen. So it shows you that when we're talking about gender, this is a fluid concept that is subject to change, in which that your expression, your definition for yourself is very fluid, and it can only happen personally in our side of the house through the exploration of the life journey of everyone. Therefore, in our world, we think that opt-out mechanism exists. If you feel that certain assignment on the gender is not compatible, you have the option to opt out to begin with. For example, if Devi wants to say that there are a lot of people that have to fit in the masculine box, if they feel like this is something that is incompatible, they can move to a femininity, for example. Or for example, if they want to move from the heterosexual box, they can move to LGBT preference box, for example, or even pansexualism, or many more. What does it tell you? It tells you that in our side of the house, the accessibility of you accessing the gender is already very, very wide. And we think that why fluidity matters in our side of the house, because we believe that this is very inherent when we're talking about feeling and also self-actualization of the people, because this is part of their identity. This gives the confirmation of them being a standout individual, and that affirmation in itself gives the emotional fulfillment for this individual. And we think that this is very, very inclusive, because it can be gotten by a lot of people regardless of their preference, because we think in our side, discussion still exists to enlarge the spectrum and to enlarge the understanding on the spectrum. That will be explained in my engagement. Then in this issue of uniqueness, there are two things that are brought by OG. Number one is that gender is a social construct. There is no proof coming from OG why at the end of the day social construct has been absolute or unchangeable. We told you that it's very, very fluid. The social construct is still a manageable issue. But even if yes, that the social construct has not been changed yet, within the discussion already increases the spectrum of gender. For example, like in the LGBT spectrum, from LGBT now we acknowledge pansexualism, we acknowledge queer, and also IA. And also for the men's and women's spectrum, we acknowledge cisgender, we acknowledge androgyny right now, not only masculine or feminine and such. We think that in our side of the house, we have proven to you that social construction is something that can be changeable. Thus, elimination of gender is not a last resort to begin with. Then two, they also told you that gender becomes a liability for capitalism. We think that at the end of the day, this is not a liability. Why? Because gender is not a determining factor of a success in capitalism. Acknowledgement towards women already increases, and there is already a growing demand that slowly pushes organic change. We've seen a lot of spectrum of women right now, the career women, celebrate women, or even women that puts their pursuit of happiness towards career advancement rather than domestic family. Notice that there is an engagement of women to pursue the success in the capitalistic structure. We think that realizing the capitalistic structure put their orientation into profit, when they acknowledge women with adequate capacity, we think that the representation of full men or holistic men will not be the prerequisite for them to reach profit, because they believe that reaching profit is accessible to everyone based on their merit. Therefore, we think that the issue will not be there. But even if there is still a preference that is being feared by OG, we think that companies right now in current context will suffer backlash, in which the growing demand coming from society to uphold fairness, to uphold fair selection, to uphold fair employment process. even government will retain their credibility by following the societal push or societal backlashes coming from the society. Then also, CG told you that right now that there are certain gender box that they need to fit in without a necessary explanation. We have mechanized to you that there is an opt-out mechanism for these people that can enable them to create a new box or new gender spectrum should they feel incompatible with the current existing box to begin with. We think that this new box exists because there is an initiative of plenty individuals right now that create exploration in the life journey. So we think that there is a huge likelihood right now in our side of the house that the gender has evolved. Not only that, not only LGBT, but right now there is a queerism, there's a pansexualism and such, or the cisgender and the androgyny that I told you earlier. Then lastly, we think that the whole government bench talks about how they want to create an individualistic approach. We think that under your side of the house, it will not be personalized. Why? Erasing the concept of gender will leave no option for the individual because realizing that your society is very, very uniform, therefore the self-actualization is going to be trapped into a constant wandering. In CO, we told you that the personalization creates the own agency for you to decide your own self-actualization and is very, very inclusive because I have told you that the accessibility of spectrums have evolved and the emotional fulfillment that you want can be reached. Therefore, we still fight for the world with gender.
Thank you. Yeah, to conclude government's case, Governor, please. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, good.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this is how I'm going to structure my speech, right? First, I'm going to discuss about opposition's idea of expression and fluidity, like from OO and closing opposition. Secondly, I'm going to discuss why our matter is more important in terms of like transgender discrimination and in terms of bisexual discrimination, and how this negates all the benefit coming from whole opposition benches, right? But first of all, I want to make two individual responses, right? For closing opposition. So they say that discrimination might exist anyway, right? In terms of race, in terms of religion or whatever, right? Okay, so I think that this is not actually the debate, right? Because under both sides, both happen. So under opposition, they have to defend why gender discrimination would not exist exclusively, because at the end of the day, the harm would double down on their side. It's basically our burden, right? I don't think that this is going to be the this is going to be the debate, right? So secondly, that they say that, oh yeah, it's because there is a symmetrical majority. I think that this is exactly what we mean, right? Majority only exists on the opposition side of the house in terms of gender. Why is that so? Because under our side of the house, people will all be will all be like the same. They only have different genitals and those type of things, right? So I think that the idea of majority is only existing on the opposition side of the house in the status quo, where people are segregated at the end of the day, right? Some people are segregated as maybe LGBTQ, so that people discriminate them, like religion discriminates them and segregates them also, and people are segregated to males and females, so there's like a chance of majority and majority power there, right? On the other side, we do not have such things as majority because we erase gender roles on overall, right? Okay, so I think that this clears out that that rebuttal coming from closing opposition, right? Okay, so firstly, let's go to the idea of expression coming from opposition, right? So I think that opening opposition has a really weird case, right? They say that people will be forced to be agender. I think that under our side of those, people won't even understand what is agender or what is gender, right? Because this is a retroactive debate. This means that in the very first start of the world, for example, gender never existed in the very first place, right? This is exactly why the idea of you being feminine, you being I don't know, masculine or whatever, it can be your own, right? Instead of for example instead of like random things, whether you are born male or female, right? So what do I mean? Under our side, sure, you might still be feminine, but it will not be related to things that if a male does it, it will be something that is girly, right? Just because you have a dick that you cannot cry, right? So I think that it just won't have like that certain type of correlation that creates discrimination, right? Secondly, I think I would like to also explain that how opposition actually constrains self-expression, right? So what opening opposition tells you and closing opposition tells you is, oh, gender is fluid, right? But I think that this is not going to be something important under our case, right? Because under opposition side of the house in the status quo, that people at the end of the day cannot express themselves through other means exactly because of gender, right? For example, if you're a female, you cannot enter SEEM, right? Because as a gender you are seen as weaker, for example, right? If you're a male, you cannot cry because that is something not masculine, for example, right? These expectations exist at the end of the day. I think that these genders hampers all type of other self exploration and self expression, right? I think that you cannot buy opening opposition's argument that is talking about gender being the most personal to you because you are exposed to it every day. I think that this is not exclusive. You can be exposed to a lot of things daily, right? You can expose to debate daily. You can be a biologist daily. You can still, for example, browse Instagram and whatever daily to become certain biologist. Like, I think that that is like a really huge spectrum, and it's different for people to people, right? But under our side of the house, this is exactly why it matters, right? It matters because we're defending people's freedom to choose, like, regardless of constraint of genders. This is exactly why opposition is trying to frame it as if opening opposition tries to say that, oh, they can have a world without discrimination, right? Okay, I'm just gonna tell you why they rebuttal towards government side of the house, because they say that there will be discrimination under both sides because people have a dick anyway, right? You know what? I'll just take this burden, right? Even if that their claim is true, I think that this proves that CG is comparatively better. Why is that so? Because this means that you only have biological differences under our side, right? But what does it mean for you to have opposition? Number one, yes, biological differences still exist under opposition. Number two, it's also translated towards social differences, right? Where you're given expectations for certain roles, right? Why is that so? I think that this elucidates because this segregates people to different groups, right? This segregates people to male and female, cis male, or LGBTQ or transgender or whatever. It gives that type of segregation on the opposition side of the house, which means that this is exactly what closing opposition says. This could make a majority, right? This could make a majority power, right? This is exactly why opening opposition's case could not would comparatively be worse, right? Because on the other side, sure, in the worst case, some people might discriminate you because you have a vagina instead of a dick. But under opposition, you are also discriminated at least in the same way, because they say that people are afraid of differences, but you are elucidating the differences under opening opposition, right? This means that their whole idea regarding a world without discrimination, a world of expression, doesn't exist, right? Because if discrimination still exists, logically speaking, then things like stereotypes, things like how social expectations will exist, because of course differences exist because differences exist, like you're fearing the unknown, as opening opposition tells you. So I think that it's comparatively worse on the opposition side of the both opening opposition and closing opposition, right? So I think that's why their case should fall. But now let's compare why Davis' argument is more important than closing opposition's contribution, right? So what is closing opposition's main contribution? They say that gender is very, very fluid, right? I think that this should be brushed off anyway, because I have already proven to you that there are other things that are more fluid, right? Such as what you want to work, like what you want to be your hobby, which is constant in opposition, because it's very hard for a male to do things like dancing or cheerleading today. Like, they might be constrained by their family, but on the other side, because there's no idea of gender, they can do that. But I think that I think another reason for that is because their fluidity isn't even inclusive under status quo or under any side of the house, right? So they say that they will have organic changes. I think that our benefit doesn't need organic changes, right? I think that one benefit we have, that we can just snap in the hand and it never happened in the very first place, right? But moreover, I think that organic changes isn't enough, right? Because even if you have a lot of societies, your fluidity will not be contained by them, right? They wouldn't care. This is exactly why David tells you why LGBTQ communities are not friendly with transgenders or bisexuals, right? Exactly because there are gender discrimination inside of it. Because in LGBT community, they expect you to not be bisexual, that your gender has to be certain one. Are you gay? Are you gay or not, for example? Right? This is also what happens to transgender people, who also get the same stereotypes. So even in these groups, you cannot be fluid. You cannot be fluid, right? So this negates closing opposition's argument, because absolutely nobody is going to be your support system. Nobody is going to care about you no matter what, right? So I think that the idea of expression isn't captured anyway by closing opposition. I'm very proud to propose this case.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for Government Whip for those remarks. And to close the debate, Opposition Whip. Here.
Check, am I audible?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay, let me arrange my paper. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that this debate is very messy because all of them give us a characteristic of discrimination that will exist in any type of differences. A lot of cases of government bench are the harm that they're talking about. For example, transgender being oppressed by women is not a product of gender, but it's product of intersectionality and the product of diversification will also exist under their side of the house when religious people oppress the non-religious individual inside the religion community, for example, ladies and gentlemen. So the burden of the whole government bench need to prove to you in this debate are they need to prove to you that what is the unique oppression that only comes in the form of gender. So with that, they're able to give us the unique harm of gender. Then all of their case is a case and argument against the diversification, and they should support the world of full of uniformity under their side of the house, which never been a burden of the government side of the house. So how closing opposition differentiate ourselves from opening opposition? OO only talk about how it's a unique, gender is unique because you can create an affiliation and it is something that's very close to you. I think that the characterization of the opening opposition was not exclusive at all because you're still able to feel close with races and religious culture because you're practically living with them. But the characterization that closing opposition talk to you about the idea of fluidity that you can use as a cop-out and exit mechanism is more exclusive thing that's something you're unable to get inside the boxes created from religion, culture, and races. Second of all, opening opposition never talk to you that why status quo is enough. They only say to you right now, men able to get wear skirt and get into the cover of magazine, but closing opposition talk and explain to you that why under these capitalistic structures, the interest of society is different right now, and why they have an inherent need to accommodate the needs of women or any other gender that being marginalized in status quo. So that's how we're going to take this debate as closing opposition. Let's start with engage in opening government. Then I will explain to you that why all of those forms of discrimination that Gov Bench talk about is not exclusive in any way. If opening government talk about the reason why there's a gender oppression because there is an innate nature that women should only be the one that giving birth to children. That's why you're going to get oppressed. But the question is become that how you're going to procreate on your side of the house. It sounds like a silly question, but you need to understand, as long as the process of procreation still exists under their side of the house, the community and the collection of people that take the role of procreation and giving birth still become the marginalized group, still become the people that's going to be oppressed under your side of the house. There is still a community that's going to be oppressed under their side of the house. But when they talk about the self-actualization coming from Kezia, and she said that all expression is better under their side of the house because right now you can choose whatever clothes that you want and you have more time to exploration. Notice that this is logically untrue because exploration is about having an option and choices, ladies and gentlemen. Under your side of the house, your exploration of self-actualization is not going to happen because it's going to be very uniform. If you want to talk about culture and religious and races, it's something that's even be more bad because the exploration is very smaller because you cannot explore your skin color, for an example, or you cannot explore dogma, for example. So if closing government also want to talk about putting people in boxes, we think that the boxes created by the religion and races is even worse because you cannot get out from those boxes, ladies and gentlemen, because you cannot simply just change your skin color under their side of the house. You cannot just simply change the culture that already being rooted under your side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. But comparatively on the other side of the house, when you talk about gender expression, I think it's way much better a mechanism because it's very fluid under our side of the house. But when we talk about progress and status quo, they only said in opening government that people will have more agency under their side of the house because people is going to be more focused. I don't think that focus is the inherent driving force for human beings to fighting for justice because as long as you're being oppressed, as long as the issue that you care about being oppressed, people will always fight for it. That is why in status quo, black people able to fight for BLM, but also able to fight for the free healthcare in the United States at the same time, and both of them is working right now in status quo. So I do not understand focus is a big thing, talking about the drafting force of create a changes, ladies and gentlemen. All of the case of the opening government is not important in this debate. Let's engage the member of government and closing government case in this debate. When they want to talk about gender expression, they never talk about the self-actualization, ladies and gentlemen, because you need to understand understand self-actualization, it's something that innate in nature. For an example, when you talk, you will always have a different identity and feeling that you are different from any other human being, because that's nature. When you're born, you're feeling that I am different with with other people around you, for example. And the only thing that can able to accommodate your innate feeling is only gender, ladies and gentlemen. Because when you talk about religion and culture, all of them are environment-based, ladies and gentlemen, not real, something that you cannot relate to because you're just living with them, ladies and gentlemen. Because when you talk about gender, right now, when you feel that you're self-different, for example, that you are masculine, but you also want to wear makeup, for example, or when you want to wear skirt, for example, at the end of the day, the existence of gender that exists in a spectrum and more fluid and more easy to be drive based on your personal necessity is the moment when you're able to get cop out. Because under the side of the house, when everything is very uniform and everything is very strict, when you feel different with yourself, instead of finding a self-actualization, you will think that yourself is crazy because there's no other platform that's able to accommodate your necessity, ladies and gentlemen. So that is the reason why. When they talk about majority and minority segregation as well, I think that it's going to be worse on the other side of the house, because majority and minority segregation based on the culture and based on the races, for an example, or religion is bad, because all of those values are rooted and too strict, and there's a huge feeling of entitlement and a human being can have. The moment they have a huge feeling of entitlement, that's the moment they don't want to listen to you at all. But because gender is very fluid and gender is very diverse, the moment when you want to talk about your grievances, people is more likely to listen to you, because at least there are some sense of relatability, because they also do not think that they're entitled to a certain value or to a certain teaching, for example, ladies and gentlemen. Biological segregation is also going to be a very strict form and something that we don't want to. But talking about getting change, Chia told you that, Abu Hafsa told you, in this capital structure, company have a need to be merit based, ladies and gentlemen. So even if you are a woman, as long as you're smart, companies still want to take you as and hire you at the end of the day. So we don't think that wise and score right now is something that's very bad. Oh, government branch only able to win if they can explain to you that why under their side of the house any other discrimination is better than the discrimination about women, and why our side of the house cannot change anything. That is the reason why CEO take this debate.
Yeah, check yung ka.
Either complete or ready for away. Good, good. Okay. Oo.
Here.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. In that case, then yeah, ready for OA. Probably not going to be the highest definition of OAs, i.e., some details might be missed, but still I'm going to compare as much as possible when it comes to the teams. Make a lot of notes for constructives. More than happy to explore them after this. Okay. I'm just going to go directly to the rankings and justify why it was given as such. Ultimately, this was a closing debate. First position went to closing government, second to closing opposition, third went to opening government, and fourth went to opening opposition, justifying it starting from CG and then moving my way down the ranks. Okay, what did CG get first? Two things we heard from CG. One is great substantiation, and number two is great clarifications on many things. Number one, what was the substantiation that mattered in this debate? That made closing government rose above the other three teams. It's a substantiation of how bad gender's behaviors are when it comes to how it manifested in the society, all of those things. Opening government has started this idea, but not necessarily with a high dedication to how bad it was. I think it was a random sort of compilation of many things, like attaining equality, radical feminism is somewhat essentialist, and maybe this is bad, exoticization of Asian women. We heard a little bit about patriarchy, we heard a little bit about women being more nurturing, but there's just more specific and more dedicated work by closing government, not just to prove what happens in a world with gender that has a quality of random that's so big in opening government, which I don't necessarily understand how bad these are. In closing government, it's less confusing, it's less random, it's much more resolved as to answering the question, look, this is what patriarchy looks like, and here's how it's bad. And that is particularly in DeFi, I really appreciated those analyses about how there's standardization as to how certain genders have to behave, how patriarchy affects a lot of women, how there's a lot of, how constantly it happens throughout history, how it also harms men. I really love Amos's work to sort of like bulk up and double down on that particular scenario on biology and how that's particularly bad, how there's a lot of rebellious forces in the society that actually is happening because people are, you know, so fed up of living in that kind of world and they really want to sort of step up. But even if stepping out, you can only do so in liberal bubbles, all of those things, right? So gender sucks, said OG. Sure, but what's the proof of that? And I think that Closing Government is the only team that kind of like gave a lot more substantiation as to how this premise is indeed proven, not just within specific context, but in quite a general regard, with a lot of substantiation in many contexts throughout history, so that the essence of time is not just about the present, it's also about the past, and also about various genders being involved, such as men and trans people, all of those things. So that's why the substantiation is much more appreciable in Closing Government as opposed to Opening Government, despite using the same premise. Closing Government definitely takes it over Opening Government. When it comes to Opening Opposition, I'm not sure that the analysis of Opening Opposition has been inflated to tackle down the substantiation part of why gender is particularly bad. I'm gonna explore in further details later on as I visit Opening Opposition, and same thing with Closing Opposition. I'm just gonna discuss why this substantiation was more meaningful than what's good about gender in Closing Opposition as I visit Closing Opposition later. Yeah, but as such, substantiation really, really well done by Closing Government when it comes to bulking up on many of those analyses. Number two, what I appreciated from Closing Government was the analysis of clarifications. I think there's three important clarifications practically by the whip. Number one is that you can't really see this world as gender or agender because in a THP motion, this House prefers motion, probably people will not have any recollection or knowledge or any kind of information as to what a world with gender looks like. It's a this House prefers motion, not this House changes something motion. There is no memory of gender, most likely. That's what's going to happen. So I think that probably that speaker is the only speaker that realizes the importance of having the world this House prefers as a lead up to the motion as opposed to any other word. So I thought that that's a particularly specific and that's a particularly refreshing clarification as what Daud said in what was a very messy debate. So I thought that that was very much needed, and I really like that when it comes to neutralizing many of the things that Opening Opposition has brought into the debate. Many are less relevant because probably this is going to only accrue in a world where people understand gender and can make the comparison between a world with and without gender. But this is a world that has never touched a lick of what gender tastes like. So probably that has to be a burden that is taken by the opposition side of the House as opposed to the other way around. Number two, what I appreciated coming from the government whip was the clarification that says, well, what they're going to do is to reduce the power of majoritarianism, because there's always going to be some majorities that's treated better, some minorities that's treated better. And if we take one factor out of majoritarianism and things that majorities can use to oppress the minority, that's probably a good thing. And this answers a lot of the things that especially Daud mentions in this debate in opposition with, saying that probably you're not going to be able to destroy any other sort of form of discrimination, such as religion and race. True, but if we take out one factor, probably it's a net benefit in that particular world as well. And I think that's like an implicit sort of intention of this point. I think that the whip could have expanded this clarification a little bit more, but there's a start to that clarification. So the logic, I think, was already presented sort of 60% of the way. And I think in that regard, it should be appreciated as well. Number three, I also appreciate that the analysis coming from Closing Government to clarify that there has to be a separation between biology and social norms. And when you still have all those biologies, like what Opening Opposition mentions, penis, cloaca, whatever, understand that you're from biology, but you probably could have talked a little bit more about the social norms as opposed to just the biological organ mentioning in this debate. And I think that that clarification works insofar as saying that we do have to talk about the social imposition of roles and all of those norms. Why is that particularly useful, OO and CO? And I think that's a kind of burden that I don't think any teams in opposition benches manage to answer in that debate. But I'm going to discuss a little bit further as I visit op bench. Yeah, but as a result to mentioning that, I think that also clarifies this has to be debate about gender, not about sex. And adding up to many of the clarification that CG is doing in the debate, probably a better setup of the debate as opposed to OG. That's why with a better setup than OG and with a better substantiation from OG's case, I thought that was enough to make closing government contribute a hell lot to this debate, even though the structure probably could have been improved in some regards. I'm more than happy to talk about that in constructives. Okay, so that's why closing government got first. Now I'm going to do the clear justification as to why that first position is justified against opposition bench, particularly against CO right now. Why did CO get second and why did CO lost against closing government? Two things I heard from CO. Number one is about the great argument on mitigation, on how right now discrimination against gender is reducing. It's not necessarily as potent as we've seen it in the past. There's so many things that has been manifesting in status quo that reduces the palpability of that particular discrimination. There's anti-discrimination growth. There's acknowledgement of various different genders. We are moving towards a world where new box have been evolving, cisgender and I don't think cisgender is a good example because cisgender is the dominant narrative of gender since the beginning of time, but you did mention androgyny, you did mention some other examples. I get the point, lad, that the new box is more appreciative to new forms of gender and all of those things. So in terms of mitigating the potency of discrimination, I think CO does a lot more better work and much more concrete sort of like focused effort in doing so rather than in the opening opposition. I think the randomness of opening opposition's jumble of many things kind of like make that power of the analysis status quo is improving, not as acute, particularly when opening opposition also mentioned things like wage gap and all of those things, not necessarily sure. Are you commenting that the status quo still have problems when it comes to gender discrimination? Or are you saying that the significance of the improvement is big enough so that I should appreciate it? Like, what's the logical impacts of the random things you mentioned? It was never necessarily clear, and I think that closing opposition is much more intentional, so to speak, when it comes to saying that status quo is getting better, right? The reason why that wasn't persuasive to sway the case away from the substantiation that Jeffy Mosley has done in this debate and is properly with by Amos is because this is indeed mitigatory in nature. You've managed to mitigate the potency of the discrimination, but not necessarily destroying it entirely though, right? Because the status quo has improvements, but still has also massive amounts of discrimination that has happened throughout the time. It's not just status quo, but it's also the past, because they did talk a little bit about historically why that's been really, really bad as well. And therefore, probably the higher moral high ground is, cool, we have some improvements and band-aids and progresses that we see in status quo, but that doesn't necessarily become more important than us regretting the entirety of discrimination that has happened throughout time, right? And ultimately that becomes the more heavy argument when it comes to moral duty and when it comes to something that's just more severe than the mitigation that CO has provided. So I don't think CO's case can stand on mitigation and mitigation alone. There has to be something else that kind of counterbalances the fact many harms has accrued. So whilst the harm can be mitigated, and I think that's a really, really appreciable analysis, it can't win you the debate. There has to be something else. What was the something else? Second clash about what's good about gender. Right now, when it comes to proving what's good about gender, I think closing opposition's analysis was rather weak, right? Because I think that the only thing that was said in closing opposition was that there's new box where gender is seen right now, androgyny, etc., all of those things, and also how it's important because it's better than religion. It's race, you cannot change it, but I mean gender, probably people can't change it that easily either. So I'm not sure why that comparative is necessarily true, and people feeling different, all of those things. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of great ideas as to how you say gender norms are good, but never necessarily structurally proven why it is indeed quite thick, more thick than what we have heard from member of governments. That's why in that comparative, I'm inclined to believe there's maybe something good when it comes to gender norms being imposed in the society, and there has been mitigated when it comes to the harms of gender norms. So great start, but I think that has never evolved beyond things that closing government has mentioned when it comes to substantiation and various clarifications against that. As a result, I really appreciate closing opposition's attempts, but I think that the bullet that's never bitten in closing opposition was what's good about gender norms that is so appreciable to the point where even though some harms may exist and mitigation don't happen and is not successful 100%, these benefits will still be able to convincingly clinch an opposition bench win over a government bench. And as such, lacking coming from CO to prove the benefit of gender norms makes closing opposition less persuasive than closing government. That's proven that the harms outweigh the benefit. And the last thing that I'm going to mention on those benefits are the analysis on androgyny, analysis of mu box, the analysis of all of those things are probably reminiscent with a case that we have heard in opening opposition. If anything, we heard things like finding identity, we've heard things like gender fluidity, Harry Styles, all of those things. We've heard them in opening opposition. So insofar as trying to steal them away from opening, I'm not necessarily sure that's quite exclusive to closing opposition. Not that you're entirely derivative, but I'm just saying that the credit must be allocated quite equally, or yeah, maybe quite equally, around 40-60%. I don't know to which side, but yeah, it was quite close when it comes to the referential nature of that particular explanation between opening opposition, which reduces further the persuasiveness that closing opposition has in terms of proving what's good about gender norms. As such, due to the nature of your core case being too mitigatory and the lack of proving about what's the benefit of having gender norms, I'm more inclined to believe that the harms totally outweigh the benefit in this debate. But why was that case coming from closing opposition still win over opening government, right? Here's the second and third comparison, and here's the long diagonal comparison. We heard three things from opening government. Number one is probably the strongest thing about gender sucks. I've touched this when it comes to comparing OG versus CG, but I thought that's just too random of many things. Attaining equality, essentialism in radical feminism, exoticization of Asian women. Patriarchy is bad somewhat, and nurturing is something that is expected of women, and that's bad. Cool, but probably there can be a lot more job done by opening government in terms of proving why these things are indeed something super harmful to many people. Like, it is harmful, but I can't really elaborate all of those things and kind of like structure them for OG and then elaborate them too for OG. It's like too much work that you're asking me to do as a judge, and that's just answering the debate too much, right? And I think that closing government's giving me less to do with what they're explaining to me, giving them the credit of substantiating these things more than what the OG does. But the other thing as to why the substantiation or the lack thereof in opening government is so dangerous is because then the mitigation that member of opposition is doing in this debate was meaningful enough to sort of like say, maybe then the problem isn't that bad because the improvement is bigger than all of these problems. So the lack of opening government in having a focused effort of substantiating gender sucks, despite that idea being so potential, makes it rather not persuasive. So I'm thinking at this point, maybe the mitigation is enough. And I think it is. So that's why at that point, that particular first clash coming from opening government is not necessarily that persuasive for me. Number two, the benefits of having a world without gender norms, same starting point, exploring yourself, beautiful words, but I think it suffers from the same two problems, which is a lack of substantiation as to what that really means. And also the third clash, has something to do with problematic exploration of these benefits, i.e., what is the world without gender? What does it look like? To the point where exploration and similar starting point is indeed possible. Because these 2 points of benefit are indeed very model dependent, isn't it? And I think that I could agree with closing government by saying that probably nobody can see a gender or gender in this new world, because this is a you totally restart history, and nobody can are able to make these comparisons. But opening government's model was that we're gonna do this at using a machine, like erase people's ability to have genders at one point, and therefore having the ability to compare between the world before gender and after that particular use of the machine. So as such, I'm not necessarily sure it does fulfill the analysis of same starting point, or exploration was proven. So yeah, two punches against opening government, right? Number one, lack of model makes these benefits are not necessarily clear. Where do you get them from? And number two, what it means such as exploration, same starting point, was also never, really developed beyond the assertion. That's why that second clash about the benefits of a world without gender is not necessarily clear either in this debate. Gender sucks, not clear. Benefit of exploration and same starting point was also not clear. That's why I thought that closing government is at least clear when it comes to mitigation, why status quo is improving by much. Number three, on the erasure, on number three, the thing that we heard from opening government was model. I thought that this is probably one of the bigger problems in the opening government's case. Erasure by machines that this house world abolished gender motion, not that this house prefers, or without gender motion, and also the definition. I thought that it's a huge conflation between gender and sex, because I think that there's a lot of, sex means jenis kelamin and gender is gender. And I think that has to be delineated in debates like this, because it's not necessarily biological determinism that needs to be defended by opposition, but it's rather the gender norms in of itself. Like, people may have different, body parts still, but if the gender norms are absent, that would have probably been okay. So I think that these kind of like just lack of concretizing the debate starting from the get-go from Prime Minister makes the case rather obscure at the end of the day. And I think that closing government just makes a little bit of a clearer attack and modeling and definitioning of what the debate is supposed to look like. So I really appreciate them for doing so. And I think the closing opposition really exploited the lack of clarity in opening government, particularly with the analysis that, look, you're not going to destroy any other sources of discrimination like religion and race. Like, what about that? And I think that's a very, very clear attack that exploited opening government's lack of, proper setup, because all of these attacks will still be into the to the opening government's case, right? Because you haven't properly defended yourself against CO at that particular behest. Not necessarily that's acceptable in closing government because of your clarification, and that's why that's a particularly important thing to discuss. Yeah, so yeah, if OG were here, I'm totally gonna ask them to make a better model. More than happy to discuss about that in constructives as well with all of you. Now, finally, opening opposition. The reason why you got fourth is that, look, I'm going to say this gently and kindly as possible because this is recorded and because this is, because y'all are my juniors and I love you. And I say this with love and care and appreciation and respect and all of these things in the world for all of you. But what was the case? I thought that there's a lot of really jumbled things thrown together, not necessarily clear what was defended. And there's a whole lot of mishmash when it comes to identity and when it comes to what is the value of gender norms, when it comes to two things. You're defending a lot of gender norms in its best form, right? Which are fluidity, Harry Styles. Everything is fantastic right now, but notice that that's a very, very, very singular unicorn scenario, best case scenario, the most convenient version of gender norms you can take, and not necessarily fair in the sense that gender norms have existed for millennia. And then if you want to sort of like pick only those examples that happened post-woke of 2016, let's say, how is that a case about gender norm instead of a case that, is so indulgent in the sense that you only want to talk about the most convenient case for your set of house? TLDR, it's so best case scenario, it's not even fair, right? It's not even charitable when it comes to the generality of that. That's why all of these fluidity and all of those things makes it very, very unclear as to why that's the charitable rendering of gender norms in general, and why that benefit isn't so specific to the point where it becomes persuasive. I thought it was too specific of a benefit because simply you're not necessarily talking about gender norms. You're talking about gender norms post 2016 wokeness, which is too specific of a case. And then closing government just said, look, this is what happens to our history, bro. So many bad things going on. Like, how do you deal with that? Obviously, those are more convincing just on the aspect of chronology. They tackled more facets of time. You're very, very insular. That's a problem. Number two, you talked about finding identities only available or is much more easy to be done if we have gender norms, but that was never really mechanized when it comes to the process of that, all of those things. It was kind of bought wholesale by closing opposition, which also suffers from the same thing, like under mechanization of that. So more than happy to talk about that identity creation and how that's important. Good start, but it's never really sort of went beyond that statement of finding identity. Now, the problem why in opening opposition opposition's case, though, it was then less persuasive than opening government, was then because the other thing that we've heard about penis and cloaca, which buys into the idea of, bad modeling by prime minister, it kind of agrees to it as opposed to clarifies it. So, I mean, I'm going to sort of repeat what I've said all the time in ITB practices. Do clarify if the definition is bad. You know what I mean? Like, and you didn't, kind of, you just let's go along with it. And no bueno. And I think that furthermore, it's also about stereotyping is good. Like, how is stereotyping good? I mean, why is the harms not necessarily meaningful for the debate? I thought that might have been a bit of an equity violation. And ultimately you say, oh, the world without gender is North Korea, which I thought that another uncharitable characterization of the government side of the house's case. And there's some sort of a mention of a wage gap over there. Not necessarily sure what it means. What I'm trying to say with all of these things is that after we isolate the potential points, finding identity and gender fluidity as being too specific and too under elaborated, the other things that was there in opening opposition's case was a collection of random things that are either too uncharitable or underexplained. Never really know what that mean, bro. So sorry for that. And I say this with love, and I think that you do have to improve from that, you know what I mean? Because I think that there's just a lot of improvement that needs to be done on that. But as such, at least opening government's analysis were not necessarily that responded by opening opposition. At least I kind of know what it means. Patriarchy is bad. Women are demanded to be nurturing. We want to explore the same, we want to let people explore from the same starting points and all of those things. And I think your wholesale agreement about the definition just allows opening government's case to work in this debate. At least CO clarifies, at least CG clarifies. And I think if OO does not clarify, then OG kind of like takes it. All of those things that I complain about OG is my complaint, not your complaint against them. So the credit cannot go to you, okay? That's okay, Noni. More than happy to talk about that. Okay. Yeah, that is why the debate was given as such. I'm so sorry for taking a bit of time. I promised short, but it wasn't that short. EFL woes. Sorry. But yeah, more than happy to discuss with all of y'all after this. Thank you very much again for the debate. Yay.
Kak Upi mau nanya kalau mau minta konstruktif di sini aja atau should I contact you personally?
Whichever you feel more comfortable, I'm okay either way sih.
Uh,
Kalau mau di sini boleh, ya kan?
Butuh
yang makanya-
pencerahan.
Iya, Kak Upi kayak
Ya, boleh.
gue tuh maksudnya kayak I understand, kayak gue tuh udah nangkep dan udah aware tentang question yang tadi si CO belum jawab. Cuma kayak gue nggak tahu jawabannya apa.
Ini gue udah tahu nih, gue udah ngerasa nih kayaknya nih karena kan poinnya agak-agak counterintuitive ya, gender norms being good. Nah ini kayak something that I'm also writing down a lot in my notes gitu. Gimana caranya ini bisa jadi kasus yang convincing lah buat opposition side of the house. Okay, so I think there's 3 things yang menurutku bisa dilakukan untuk membuktikan bahwa gender norms are actually a good thing. Number 1 is about collectivizing with others. It's always about like it's the question that is answered mostly in second wave feminism kan, yang kayak you want to have a lot of identity that are able to resonate with a lot of people. And the reason for this is that obviously human beings are social creatures. We definitely need to collectivize in one way or the other. And we find similarities with others in order to sort of like find, hey, you understand what I'm going through. Hey, you understand what I feel, and all of the feeling of kinship. And this happens in various regards. It happens in religion. And when there's no kind of like clear differentiator, clear characterization of the differences between these people, we create it, like what we create gods, like how we create religion, like how we create belief system, all of those things. Because I mean, yeah, there's just a lot of proof in history in which people fabricate religion, people create these kind of systems of worship just so that they can find something common that they can do. And gender is one huge aspect of that. With human beings have a nature of socialization, with human beings have a nature of being stronger in communal entity, as a communal entity, it's very, very much important to have a system where people can feel like they're part of a collective, like they're part of the other, like they have something that they have some similarities with other people that differentiates themselves with other people. Now, this is very, very important so that that collectivization can be done as a process, and it's also a process political system, but also because you have to justify why you can't like somebody else, why you don't click with somebody else, why it's not necessarily the same your experience with someone else is, right? And in a world without gender, probably this process is going to be much harder to do, because then you don't have these delineating factors. Then you always have to think, I have to psychoanalyze that person in order to define or justify why I want to relate with them, why I don't like, why I can't relate with them, why I feel safer with them, why I don't do them. That's just very, very tiring. That's just very, very taxing in the forms of collectivization. Imagine you have to go through your work. Imagine you have to sort of like find solidarity when you have problems or anything like that. And then you just have to create an interview that breaks down all of those difficult sort of aspects of psychology on other people in order for you to be able to understand that, okay, I can feel safe collectivizing myself in this particular group or anything like that. Sure, is that a perfect process? No, right? Because collectivizing this way is basic and very much on the surface, and you do have to take a look ultimately at the psychology of certain people that you align with, all of those things, whether or not they fit. And similarity of gender certainly is not a perfect and end goal of any sort of form of collectivization, but it's a great start. And that great start is a net benefit in and of itself. And you don't want to lose that great start. You don't want to lose that concept. And that's why it's particularly not good to lose this collectivization value of a community that makes us lose an aspect of how we can congregate with other people effectively. Number two, the benefit of having gender norms is very, very much important in history. I think that you could definitely closing government's idea about patriarchy is really, really bad. That's true, but this is because patriarchy has gone unchecked. For many communities, the delineation of gender roles, women, for example, being asked to do things that are more domestic, and men being asked to work in the agricultural field, has benefits of ensuring that more muscles are assigned to the field, and women take care of the children, for example, because they're much more equipped to do so, biologically speaking, and all of those things, right? So the gender role has created a lot of has created a lot of value on society, has created a lot of understanding that we are actually translating the biological strengths of certain genders into how they can functionally being put into society as well, because there's just so much pragmatic means. What I'm trying to say here is that the criticism against gender only happens in the last several centuries, and that's very much because we have gone through industrial revolution, and then we understand now the job is very much office oriented. It's not necessarily that physically heavy anymore, so we don't have to do all of those things, right? But before, it's a much easier and understanding to sort of like break genders and all of those things, and we gain so much pragmatic benefit out of it. Again, the nuancing on that is to say, if we say gender roles are useful, are we okay to say that it is problematic at the same time? Of course, we can do it. We can do it by saying that gender norms being imposed too much and co-opted by men and entrenching it in the law is really, really bad. But what we believe here in opposition is that we believe that there's a lot of values that earlier societies in history and community, in humankind, civilization creation, we've derived a lot of benefit from gender roles. So all we need to do is that we can't sort of like regret it to the entire history and kind of like we prefer a world without. It's a world that functions much better with gender roles. Now our job is just to fix all of the problems in which patriarchy has gone way, way, way too far. So the more realistic scenario is not to prefer, is a throw a baby out with the bathwater kind of situation. When gender roles manifestation is problematic in today's world and context, then we fix it, contextually speaking, not necessarily preferring a world that changes the entire history, because all of the benefits that we have accrued in the past were valid survival benefits. Is very useful for humanity, all the pragmatic benefits of those things. Ya, number 3 adalah menurut gue instrumental establishment of a sense of self gitu loh. For young people, it's very easy to identify, like, look, you are a girl, take a look at your body, take a look at how you feel. It's similar with other girls, other boys who have the pretty much same body and all of those things. And that's an initial development of establishing a sense of self in which you know who you are, in which you feel secure of who you are. And it's much easier for people to have that. And why is this important to talk about self-identity this way, having more factors than less? Because Amos's clarification is to say, well, ada yang lain kali, gitu-gitu kan, and I think closing opposition also said that. Then you have to say that there has to be more ways in which children identify who their sense of self is, starting from a very young age, such as, oh, I'm a girl, but I'm a black girl. I'm a black girl from a religious community, for instance, compared to other people. This is a much faster introduction to children about intersectionality, about the fact that people's identities are complex, that you may have differences and similarities at the same time with other people. Why is this important? This is important because this helps children to have a very complex identity about themselves, understand them correctly, and then understand that other people may be in that particular state of duality, right? You are both the same and different with other people. Imagine if you are so used to thinking you're the same with everyone because there is no gender, and then suddenly, boom, when you're 17, there's other things. There's difference of religion, there's different phrases, especially because schools are rather insular, early age educations are rather insular, all of those things. Terus kayak tiba-tiba pas university, you kind of like want to make them all crazy. That's really, really difficult. So a world with gender is a much easier world because then people can crystallize their identity is. It's a very simple way for people to identify their identity. It's less abstract than religion. It's much more tangible. It's much more easy for young learners, for kindergarten kids, for elementary school kids to identify their identity that way. And then after that, they can complexify. After that, it's much easier for them to always manage multifaceted identity and also then complexify later on, if that makes